Amsterdam, Dutch Republic, the 1630s. Here's how the story goes. A sailor is doing some business with a merchant, and as they conclude their meeting, the hospitable merchant rewards the sailor for his good service by giving him a fine red herring for breakfast. But the sailor is disappointed. A single herring doesn't really make a meal, you know? And spotting an onion on the table, the sailor pockets it to have alongside the fish. Technically stealing, of course, but it's just an onion, right? Then a while later, as the sailor had just finished his pilfered breakfast, the merchant finds him, backed by a mob. After being seized, dragged through the streets, and thrown in prison, the confused sailor finally discovers the source of his predicament. See, the onion he stole and ate wasn't an onion at all, but a prized Semper Augustus tulip bulb, valued at 3,000 guilders. Enough, the merchant says, to feast the Prince of Orange and the entire court. For the Netherlands, you see, was in the grip of Tulip Mania. Of course, if you happen to be in the grips of extra history mania, then why not check out our updated store rail right underneath this video for calendars, puzzles, plushies, pins, and a bunch more stuff. Please check it out, it helps support the channel. In the early 1600s, the Dutch Republic was the most advanced economy in the world. Newly independent from Spain and reaping the benefits from the wildly successful Dutch East India Company, they began an era of financial innovation, creating formalized stock markets, business contracts, investments, and joint stock companies. They positioned themselves at the cutting edge of the financial world we know today. And during this golden age, Amsterdam exploded into a metropolis made rich off the fruits of foreign trade, backed by prudent investment. Meaning those living in the Grand Canal side mansions were not aristocrats, but merchants, ship owners, and heads of trading houses. But then the tulips came. To summarize what happened, let's turn to Charles Mackay's classic 1841 sociology text, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which, I'm sure based on the title is a very, very trustworthy source. It states, in 1635, those eccentric Dutch upper classes became fascinated by the tulip. They loved and cherished them, it was the fad to end all fads, and everyone who was anyone had to own some. These flowers, they realized, were nice flippin' tulips. Especially prized were the rare varieties, the Viceroy, the Admiral of Admirals, the Alexander the Great, and especially the Semper Augustus. These were tulip strains with unusual designs that changed with each flowering, meaning each bulb was entirely unique and unable to be replicated. They really were, for all intents and purposes, non-fungible tulips, and their prices rose higher and faster than the rest. Seeing this, prudent investors realized that tulips were appreciating in value and decided to buy in themselves. After all, prices were going up fast, and if you bought in and, could find a buyer, there was a neat financial turnaround on these nice flippin' tulips. Indeed, by 1636, the trade in tulips was so hot, people decided they didn't even want to wait and see what they were getting. Okay, check this out. When you bought a tulip in the standard way, you often bought the flower whole to transplant in your garden, or you could buy the bulb of a tulip to replant, which gave you a genetic copy of the flower that you saw. But in that old-fashioned way of thinking, that meant that the trading season was confined to the flowering season, where you could see what kind of tulip you were buying. But that changed when flower dealers began offering contracts on tulips still in the ground that would flower the next summer. Now, people were not actually buying the tulips themselves, rather buying a contract that allowed them to buy a tulip. Essentially, a futures market. You could buy a piece of paper for 300 guilders, guaranteeing you the option of buying a specific tulip when it bloomed, with the hopes that that tulip would ultimately be worth more than that, and you could sell it for profit. You were investing, essentially, in near-future tulips. But then people started trading the contracts for near-future tulips, and the market went out of control. Because you could turn a profit immediately, provided you bought the contract, then found someone to buy that contract off of you for a higher price. Some contracts changed hands that way 10 times a day, with the price inflating with each exchange. And it might have been alright if new investors hadn't gotten involved to make a quick buck. As the price went up and up, everyone in the Netherlands started throwing their money into tulips. Carpenters took out loans on their tools to buy bulbs, and chimney sweeps invested what little they had. It became a financial run where people snapped up every tulip available. Those unable to purchase the most rare and expensive bulbs instead bought more common tulips in bulk, glorying in the riches they would assuredly have when they offloaded their baskets of full bulbs. Absurdities became a daily occurrence. A visiting English botanist, unaware of the craze, cut open a bulb in order to demonstrate a principle of his science and was jailed. Tulips began to sell for 5,000 guilders, as much as a large, well-appointed canal-side mansion, when the yearly salary for a carpenter was 250 guilders. A man even traded a profitable brewery for a single Semper Augustus bulb. These worthless flowers, which no one really wanted except to sell, had created the world's first financial bubble. And when it burst in February 1637, it ruined some of the best merchants in the country and drove many into bankruptcy. The economy entered a depression, and the canals of Amsterdam were full of the pitiful splashes of penniless businessmen committing suicide by throwing themselves into the unforgiving waters. This is the Tulip Mania as you see it in business articles, textbooks, and even in the recent sequel to Wall Street. And everything from the dot-com bubble to the housing bubble to Beanie Babies, Pokemon cards, the rise of Bitcoin, and yes, of course, the scourge that is NFTs, have been compared to the infamous time Holland ruined itself over worthless flowers. Except, and I hate to do this to you, almost none of what we just recounted is accurate. Exactly. Yeah. Turns out pop culture's whole understanding of this event is also not fully true. Oh, and those stories about the sailor and the English botanist, they're both likely total fabrications. In the last decade, however, historians have returned to the Tulip Mania and begun to reevaluate what happened and the lessons we should draw from it. So here's what's true. In the 1630s, the Netherlands was a financial powerhouse, and it did have a brisk trade in tulips. Some of those tulip prices, such as those going for the value of a house, are well documented and accurate. It's even true that people traded futures contracts for tulips, and there was indeed a steep decline in value in 1637. So Tulip Mania was a real, often kind of hilarious thing that did happen. It's just the details of the popular version of the story are fundamentally wrong. So, we're going to spend this series laying out how the myths formed, what really happened, and what this historical tale can teach us. According to recent scholarship, like that of historian Anne Goldgar, the tulip trade had a relatively small number of participants. It was nowhere near as fevered as it's often claimed, and crucially, it didn't cause an economic depression. In fact, Goldgar couldn't find records of a single bankruptcy resulting from the Tulip Mania. There's even a debate over whether this famous first asset bubble was really a bubble at all. This is partially because financial bubbles happen when an asset is overvalued, since people are investing in order to make money rather than because they want the asset. In other words, I don't necessarily want this ugly picture of a monkey. I just think I might be able to sell it to some sucker later for more than I paid for it. But here's the thing. People in the 17th century Netherlands really wanted tulips. A rare tulip was a status symbol that marked you out as educated, wealthy, and of discerning taste. People had their portraits painted holding prize tulips and displayed them in their gardens in front of those canal-side mansions. The ones they weren't committing suicide out of. They wanted them because tulips were beautiful, extremely collectible, and difficult for people to grow, meaning they were rare in the classic sense of the word, not in some sort of digital design scarcity scheme. Now I know how all that sounds. Tulips rare in Holland. Yeah, because let's do a thought experiment real quick. Close your eyes. No, actually close them, and imagine what Holland means to you visually. Okay, now open them. First of all, if you saw the sloth on the surfboard, you cheated. But second, I'm going to bet you imagined windmills, wooden clogs, canals, and fields of tulips, right? But here's the kicker. Tulips aren't native to the Netherlands. In fact, they're from Western Asia and only arrived in the Netherlands shortly before Tulip Mania began. And the story of how they got there is a great big, neat, fun tale, which includes nomad horsemen, Ottoman sultans, and pleasure gardens. Plus, we'll see how these very serious, soberly dressed Dutch Calvinists went gaga for flowers, whose beauty came not from breeding, but from a disease. Outside Amsterdam, 1625. Adrian Pauw is a big man in Amsterdam. He's one of the political worthies of the city, the closest thing the United Provinces have to a prime minister, and one of the richest men in the Netherlands. His stately manor outside the city grounds is so vast, he opens it as a public park on the weekends. And his greatest pride is his bed of rare tulips. From the walking path, you can see hundreds of blossoms. Or so it appears. If you go closer, you'll notice something unusual. At the center of the field sits a single tulip bed, and around it are a cunning set of mirrors, creating an illusion of plenty. Oh yeah, even Adrian Pauw, with his immense wealth, can only afford a few dozen tulips. We started our exploration of the Dutch Tulip Mania, supposedly the first asset bubble in history, and we closed by mentioning that one of the great myths of the Tulip Mania is that the flowers themselves were useless and unwanted, that people were only investing in them due to their perceived value for resale. But that isn't true. The traders and tulip fanciers of the Netherlands thought the flowers had intrinsic value, and they weren't the only ones. Tulips had been popular for centuries. See, tulips don't come from Europe. They're native to the lower regions of the Tian Shan Mountains, which separates what now is China from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, right on the Silk Road. A hardy flower, it could survive under winter snow, but was little like the domesticated tulips we know today. This flower, easily transported by digging up the bulb, moved westward to Persia, where it became a symbol of beauty and romantic love. Several famous Muslim poets used them in their writing. But it was one particular group of Turkic nomads, who would eventually be known as the Ottomans, who held the tulip in particularly high esteem. To the Ottomans, the tulip had multi-layered significance. It was seen as a favored flower of God, since its name in Arabic, lale, contained the same letters as Allah. It represented the beauty and perfection of God's creation, and since certain branches of Islam had a prohibition against depicting the human form in art, stylized tulips became a popular subject for intricate pattern work on clothing. However, due to the prohibition on displaying images, these patterns appeared on underclothing, such as shirts or underwear. Though in later centuries, the ban would become less stringent, allowing those tulip designs to appear on clothes, flags, military helmets, and as architectural decorations. The Ottoman love affair with the tulip was a lasting one. When Mehmed II took Constantinople, he established a tulip garden that still survives to this day. During the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Sultan wore tulip designs. It was the fashion for men to place tulips in their turbans, and thousands of gardeners tended the grounds at Topkapi Palace. Gardeners who looked pretty intimidating, because in addition to keeping the grounds and guarding the Sultan, they had another role, as executioners. Any vizier who was summoned to the throne room and saw the head gardener present knew he was there to prune more than the bushes, if you catch my meaning. Executions aside, to this day, the tulip remains a symbol of Turkey and appears on Turkish Airlines jets. An ambassador to the Holy Roman Empire supposedly brought tulip bulbs to Europe in 1558, but evidence suggests they were already there. What's sure is that we can attribute their spread through Europe to a single eccentric botanist. Carolus Clusius was born in the Netherlands in 1526, and originally studied to become a lawyer and theologian before switching to medicine. Though he wasn't that interested in healing people, rather, he was into horticulture and botany. And the only people who worked in those disciplines were doctors trying to find new medicines. Botany was exploding then. New samples were coming from the Americas, the first botanical gardens formed, and book technology had reached a point where botanical encyclopedias could be mass-produced. Clusius got his medical degree and dove right into writing several landmark books about plants. A constant letter writer, he also kept correspondence with botanical enthusiasts across Europe. And there were a lot, since gardening was a rising leisure activity among aristocrats and the middle class. But he also sent more than letters. Clusius was happy to ship his friends seeds, bulbs, or cuttings from interesting specimens so they could grow new and rare plants themselves. And to be clear, this was extremely generous of him, since competition for new specimens and exotic plants at the time was very fierce. In fact, there was a roaring trade in plant theft, with researchers or even private collectors hiring gangs to conduct midnight raids on their rivals' gardens. Clusius himself fell victim to this at least twice, once even suffering the indignity of taking a tour of a private collection and realizing that most of the woman's specimens came from his own garden. But it was when Clusius accepted a job heading the Imperial Medical Garden in Vienna that he met his true horticultural love. Because the friend who got him that gig was, guess who? The tulip transporting ambassador. Clusius would subsequently spend much of his life researching, investigating, cataloging, and generally geeking out about tulips. And when he took a new job to establish a botanical garden in the Dutch university town of Leiden, he took his tulips with him. It turned out tulips were tailor-made for the Netherlands, growing well in the poor sandy soil of the coast and able to weather the cold and wet climate. But what especially fascinated Clusius was how tulips could be cross-pollinated and hybridized to create new varieties. Within a few decades, new yellow and purple tulips emerged, and the dagger-like petals of the Ottoman tulips softened to the now customary shape. Yet to Clusius, the most intriguing of all were broken tulips, certain specimens that exhibited odd patterns with flame-like stripes or speckles. Now, seeds grown from these specimens didn't produce this effect, but offsets, little subsidiary bulbs to the main tulip bulb, would carry the trait once they flowered 2 years after planting. Of course, Clusius couldn't know that this was not an inherent trait, but due to a virus. These tulips, considered the most beautiful and valuable, were actually infected with what is today known as mosaic virus, causing a loss of color in interesting patterns. However, this also made these bulbs sickly, so they produced fewer offsets, 1 or 2 per year rather than 4, meaning these most desirable tulips were also the rarest. Clusius, true to form, spent his time in the Netherlands literally giving tulips away. He shipped bulbs to almost anyone who asked, single-handedly planting tulips all across the United Provinces, while also producing knowledge on how to grow and hybridize them, literally sowing the seeds of Tulip Mania. Oh, and y'all, people wanted these tulips. They wanted them bad. Because though the newly independent United Provinces of the Netherlands had become the richest country in Europe due to the Baltic trade, land reclamation, and stock markets, there wasn't really a lot for the rich to spend money on. You see, the Netherlands was not just a Protestant country, they were strict Calvinists. You could be fined for telling jokes in church, reading material was usually moralistic in nature, and everyone was supposed to wear the same pattern of black and white clothing. So here you are, a wealthy merchant. You've got all this money. What do you spend it on? What's a status symbol that aligns with your beliefs? Well, you can't go sponsoring gold altarpieces for the church. No flashy clothes. You could get a nice canal-side mansion outside Amsterdam, but then what are you going to put in it? Well, how about a cabinet of curiosities? To show how educated you are by having your own little museum, complete with stuff like, seashell. Seashells are popular. Ooh, how about a Baroque painting? Nice. Oh, but you still have money, huh? How about a Baroque painting of you with your seashell? Boom, there it is. Now, of course, we're having a little fun here. But really, for these folks, tulips offered a perfect solution. Since a tulip was made by God, there was nothing vain about it. Since it required special knowledge to grow and care for, it showed off how smart you were, and growing tulips was a process of honest toil in the open air, so it wasn't considered frivolous. Best of all, it had a sense of the exotic East so popular in the Netherlands, a country made rich by the Asia trade. Also, look, something's gotta go in the mansion's big front yard, right? But only the finest tulips would do, not the common variety. Broken tulips were best, or any of the recently created varieties with subtle color shifts. Yet since they were newly invented, those most coveted tulips were the hardest to get. And since the rich were so interested in buying tulips, it only made sense that others would be interested in selling them. So it's Haarlem in 1636, and you want to buy a tulip. All right, here's what you do. Head to a tavern and fumble your way through the pipe smoke to find the tulip traders, colloquially known as the college. Now, if you're lucky, there's an auction going on, but not to worry. If not, just tell the college you're interested and they'll set you up with a seller. That's a beautiful violet. Okay, how much? Well, that's up to you. You write your low bid on a slate, and the seller writes their high bid. Then you pass both of those to the college, and they pick a number between the two that they think is fair. And if you both agree, the sale goes through. And to thank the college, you buy them a pitcher of wine, and everybody gets sloshed. Then an hour passes, and someone asks you, "Hey, buddy, you selling that tulip over there?" "Oh, tavern keep, more wine, please." Ain't capitalism grand? We talked about how the Netherlands fell hard for tulips. By having one, it showed you were educated and worldly, and put you into a class with the best people. Which was no small thing in a society like the United Provinces, which as a republic generally governed through local bodies, and aristocrats had limited power. There, status usually came from how rich you were, plus your standing in religious groups, trade associations, and roles in local government. In other words, it was a world that, while family counted for much, you could theoretically buy and maintain access to. Owning goods like tulips, Netherlandish paintings, or a painting of you with your tulip could signify that you were part of that world and help you make connections with others of your desired class. Which was a big concern in the United Provinces, since their break from Spain and tolerant religious policies triggered an influx of immigration. There were Calvinist immigrants from the rest of the Netherlands, Jews seeking refuge, minority Protestants like the Mennonites, and Catholics who wanted a part of the lucrative sea trade. Frequently, these immigrants were artisans and trade people with money, wanting to establish themselves in both business and society. And things like investing in Netherlandish paintings or tulips helped in that transition. Oh, you heard right, investing. Because tulips could also bring in cold, hard guilders. And in a society like the United Provinces, with its stock markets, shipping investments, and where, thanks to grain imports, commoners could work as artisans rather than farmers, making money was on people's minds. But how exactly do you monetize tulips? Well, think of it for a moment, not as a flower, but as a show dog. If you buy or raise a show dog, and it's a champion, you could monetize it by selling it. I mean, you could do that if you were a cold-hearted monster. "Oh, you're pretty attached to this good boy." So, better to breed the champion dog and sell the puppies. Or have people pay you to breed their dog with yours, right? With tulips, it's the same thing. Of course, you could raise and sell a tulip, and many people went into business as growers doing just that, but you could also sell the offsets. These so-called daughter bulbs that would become full tulips in 2 years, and while there was no guarantee that the resulting flower would look similar to the parent, a broken tulip usually stayed broken. In other words, there was an entire little trade and economy around tulips with its own markets, practices, and rituals. First of all, there was a trading season for tulips. The flowers bloomed in April and May, and taken out of the ground in what was called lifting time in June. Thus, summer was the tulip trading season, when a buyer could inspect flowers before they withered and went dormant, and buy the bulbs directly for cash before planting them in their own gardens in October, where they'd pass the winter. But then someone thought, wouldn't it be great if you could buy tulips year-round? That's where the colleges came in. These were unofficial organizations based in taverns and inns that created a framework for bulb trading and a sort of semi-legitimate body. I mean, you couldn't trade flowers on the stock market. So they developed a system where bulbs were priced by weight using a spectacularly small measure called aces, usually used for gold. The heavier the bulb, the more it was worth. But here's the crucial part. Instead of buying a bulb, you would buy an option to buy a bulb come lifting time. This is what's known as futures trading, and it was already being practiced on the Amsterdam stock market for grain and lumber. For example, say person A wants to buy a tulip and enters a contract with a grower that agrees, when lifting time comes, that they'll buy a fine red-striped tulip for 100 guilders. To secure the contract, person A then pays the grower a 10% deposit. And if when lifting time comes, that tulip is worth 150 guilders, person A can pay the remaining 90 guilders owed to the grower and then sell it for 50 guilders of profit. But you know, why wait that long? If person A made a contract to buy a 100 guilder tulip, and person B offers them 150 for said contract a month before lifting time, it would be smarter for person A to take the money right now, right? I mean, it removes the risk. So now instead of trading bulbs, you're trading for a piece of paper saying you own the option to buy those bulbs. Starting to, sound a bit familiar. But wait, there's more. See, those people buying those contracts are often not actually handing over money for them, just a promise to pay when they eventually sell the tulip. So imagine if after person B buys the contract for 150 guilders, they sell it to person C for 200. Come lifting time, person C buys the tulip and sells it for 250 guilders, then keeps 50 guilders and uses 200 to pay off person B, who keeps 50 guilders and pays person A 150. Boom! Everybody profits! I mean, what could possibly go wrong with this paper chain of dubiously enforced contracts for a bulb that's still in the ground and that no one who's buying it has ever actually seen, right? Everyone gets instantly rich as long as person C can sell that tulip. Wait, what if they don't? This type of trading was called the wind trade, where nothing was physically exchanged apart from promissory notes, a practice that became far more dangerous as some traders practiced leveraged buys, the act of taking out a loan you don't have the capital to cover. I mean, after all, if you have 50 guilders, why just put 5 guilders down on one 50 guilder tulip when you could put 5 guilders down on 10 50 guilder tulips? Huh? I mean, if the value goes up, it's practically not even a risk. And a lot of people suddenly had money to spend and gamble on the trade. There were the rich with their new money, sure, but there had also been a terrible plague epidemic in 1636 that had killed a significant amount of people in the Netherlands, meaning the survivors were suddenly flush with inheritance money. So why not play around with it? Tulip prices in 1636 and 1637 went to the moon. And not only the rare varieties that were always expensive, but also baskets of common tulips sold by weight. In a single month, a relatively common yellow and red tulip variety called Swisters increased in value 12-fold, from 125 guilders per pound on December 31st, 1636, to 1,500 guilders per pound on February 1st, 1637. Oh, and for reference, this is a time period where a skilled carpenter made around 250 guilders a year. So yeah. Tulips got so valuable, people were sleeping in their flower beds to guard them, or rigging strings around their gardens tied to bells so they could be alerted of any garden raiders. And then, on February 5th, 1637, the biggest prophet of the craze bloomed. For that was the day the whole tulip collection of Wouter Winkel went up for auction. Winkel had been a tavern keeper and grower, known to have one of the greatest collections of rare tulips in all of the Netherlands. But in the summer of 1636, he passed away, leaving his several children in the care of an orphanage. So they would auction his collection to give his kids something to live on. The bidders were invited to come and look through a 124-page watercolor catalog showing the collection, though by that time, the most expensive had already been bought in a private sale. A fine admiral tulip with an offset for 5,200 guilders, and a pair of violet tulips for 3,200. It was a frenzy. Tulips went for prices 2 or 3 times what they'd been demanded a year before. And when the smoke cleared, the several orphans had made an unthinkable 90,000 guilders from the sale, in cash. Enough that, if they were frugal, none would have to work again. Oh, and they would be grateful the sale happened when it did, because just days later, the tulip bubble burst, and everyone's favorite floral moonshot came crashing back to Earth. Haarlem, February 10th, 1637. The college meets in their usual tavern, ready to begin a robust day of trading. To kick things off, one seller decides to test the market with an easy auction. He offers swisters at a rate of 1,200 guilders per pound, a standard price. But no one calls for Slate and Chalk to bid. Okay, how about 1,100 a pound? Still no takers. Things in the tavern go quiet. Traders sipping beer, laying out their futures contracts, stop and look up. Okay, 1,000 guilders. Anyone? Come on, gentlemen, this is an incredible deal. No bids. None at all. The bottom has fallen out of the tulip market, and all of these men who 10 seconds ago were wealthy on paper now hold contracts full of nothing but empty promises. Even before the bottom fell out of the tulip market in early February 1637, there were signs that tulip traders were in trouble. There was, for instance, the simple fact that prices had risen so high, and not just for the very fine and rare individual tulips like the Viceroy and Semper Augustus, but also the more ordinary varieties had shot up in value, even those sold by the pound. And there was probably another kind of volatility, that of personal taste. See, while everyone agreed which tulips constituted the top tier of the market, those were generally unattainable. In the 1620s, there were only around a dozen Semper Augustus tulips in all of the Netherlands, and all held by one individual. It was only when he sold a single bulb that they started to slowly propagate, taking years for each generation of offsets to fully grow. But below that, kinda like with art, it's really a matter of personal taste and fashion. One variety of tulip might be more popular and sell for more in Amsterdam than Haarlem, or vice versa. And a tulip considered aesthetically pleasing and desirable today might be upstaged by a newly hybridized variety emerging the next year. And we can actually see this by the grandiose names growers christened their tulips with. One, named Admiral, would get successful, until of course it met a challenger named Admiral of Admirals. Simple novelty did play a role. And like today's art market, one person just might think a tulip was great, while another hated it entirely. Multiple bulbs were promoted as the thing that would finally unseat the Viceroy or Semper Augustus, but none did. The most extreme version of this were the efforts to breed a pure black tulip, which was believed, if produced, to be the most valuable tulip ever. Rumor had it a grower produced one, and offered it for sale. The next day, a consortium of 3 growers from Haarlem showed up to see it, and amazed, offered him 1,500 guilders for the flower. He accepted, they carried it outside, then threw it on the street, stomping and grinding their heels into it. "Fool!" they yelled. "We would have paid 5,000! We have a black tulip too, but now ours is the only specimen." This, like many tulip tales of the time, never happened. In fact, only in the modern day did someone actually manage to create a black tulip, and even then, it's actually just very dark purple, though the myth did inspire an Alexandre Dumas novel. So, there was already trouble with market volatility and sky-high prices when the tavern scene from the intro of our episode played out in Haarlem. Over the next 2 weeks, the downturn spread, with prices crashing across the United Provinces. Now, pricing data on tulips is fragmentary and hard to compare, but it seems that between February and May, some varieties dropped 95% in value. Several theories seek to explain this drop. Perhaps prices simply got too high, and traders realized they couldn't possibly find someone to buy. That's the traditional story, and would indeed make the Tulip Mania the world's first economic bubble. But there is a rival theory. See, the crash seems to have begun in Haarlem, which is significant because it has a warmer climate than the other cities where tulips were traded. What does that mean, you ask? Well, perhaps everything. Because tulips start to emerge in February in Haarlem, and with interest in tulips on the rise for years, and more growers getting into the market, it would make sense if the 1637 crop was the largest ever seen. All those planted seeds and offsets were coming up, meaning there was a greater supply of tulips, making the ones people already held less valuable. Not a bubble, but a simple result of supply and demand. This would also explain why the best and rarest variety of tulips did not dive in prices as badly as the others, because there were still very few of them, and it also explains a rumor that Dutch troops were sent to trample the tulip fields in a bid to stabilize prices. Now, is that rumor true? No, not in the slightest. A fiction, total fabrication. But it is the kind of rumor that would start if the problem was oversupply rather than a market bubble. And that's when the repercussions started. Last episode, we talked about how futures contracts had been sold and resold with little or no money changing hands, and that if the person left holding the contract couldn't sell the tulip, it would set off a chain reaction where everyone along the line didn't get paid what they were owed. But in actuality, it goes beyond that. See, these futures contracts were not agreements to buy the bulb, but the option to buy the bulb. There was no legal requirement to purchase this tulip, and it was frankly dubious if the promissory notes holding the chain of buyers together were even legally enforceable. In most cases, little to no money had ever changed hands while passing the contract on. And for the record, while we hear about contracts changing hands 10 times in a single day, when historian Anne Goldgar dove into the actual documents, she never found a chain of ownership longer than 5 people. But none of that stopped people from going to court. Specifically, the Court of Holland, the highest court in the land. Sellers took their buyers in for non-payment, and buyers whose friends guaranteed a loan so they could buy a tulip took them to court for not ponying up. Basically, when the bottom fell out, everyone just refused to pay everyone else and tried to sue each other. And after a short period of looking at this mess, the Court of Holland made an announcement. Hi, hello. After investigating the relevant facts, we at the court believe that the backbone of our young nation are strong city governments that can best address these local concerns. So, yeah, cities, you sort this out. We're done with all this. We're not even gonna hear Tulip Kids anymore, so, bye. We'll see you next time we do this meeting. This was great. Okay, see you, bye. Buyers and sellers fought it out in city courts for months, with the result generally being that buyers at most ended up paying around 3 to 10% of the promised price. Most people didn't pay anything at all. In fact, in a few cases, debt collectors tried to shake loose tulip money decades after the buyers were already dead, bugging their next of kin. In other words, not many people actually lost money in the tulip crash. Most of the wealth gained was on paper, not in cash, and the people who handed over hard currency for tulips were those that could afford to lose it. Of course, that's not to say there was no financial pain. Clearly, there were some people hit hard, especially the growers, expecting those futures contracts to be made good. But it should be noted that Goldgar was unable to find a single bankruptcy traceable to tulips. In fact, the tulip trading market appears to have been very small, and mostly carried out among friends and neighbors. One theory even has it that the whole thing was a mostly farcical game to keep people entertained during the winter. Regardless, the Dutch economy trundled on unaffected. But while the Tulip Mania wasn't a financial crisis, the extreme cycle of boom and bust initiated a full-blown moral panic, as Dutch Calvinists used it as a way to critique what they saw as the excesses of capitalism. After all, was it not sinful to make money by investing rather than honest work? Why, if that were allowed to run rampant, the most undeserving lower classes could rocket their way to the top of society in a most unnatural way. I hope you can hear me clutching my pearls through my voice. April 1637, Amsterdam. 2 months after the tulip crash, buyers and sellers are still fighting it out in the courts, and pamphlets about the Tulip Mania are everywhere. People read them aloud in taverns, buy them on street corners, and pass them around social functions. Tulip trading was immoral, they say, unchristian, even pagan. Some suggest the whole thing stemmed from a dark cabal who controlled the market, made their money, and then crashed the price. Others say the tavern colleges engaged in price fixing or intentionally drove up auctions. A few even claim individual sellers had been counterfeiting tulips, passing off lesser bulbs as more valuable ones. The Tulip Mania may be over, but the reaction to it will be a full-blown mania in and of itself. When the Court of Holland threw up its hands and told cities to sort out the problem of tulip lawsuits for themselves, it did, at least, give some directions for doing so, and most cities followed that model. Contracts made after a certain date were cancelled outright, and both lawyers and notaries were instructed not to make any more contracts involving tulip trading, and buyers who agreed on purchasing tulips with promissory notes could be released from them by paying a percentage of the contracted price. But how big should that percentage be? Well, instead of fighting it to death in the courts, most cities recognized that this was essentially a neighborhood problem, friends trading with friends. So cities told the claimants they should settle out of court using arbitration if necessary. And for the vast majority of these cases, this actually worked, with payments averaging between 3.5 and 10% of the promised amount paid in easy installments. It was a very uncapitalist solution to a capitalist problem, one that harkened back to earlier economic systems that prized civic harmony over individual wealth. An attitude that helped prevent the mania from becoming a full-on financial crisis. But there was another form of crisis brewing around the Tulip Mania, one over moral and social norms. See, even though the Dutch Republic was the most advanced economy in the world, capitalism itself was still fairly new and hadn't yet fully meshed with Protestant thought. How is it in keeping, for example, to be charitable and love thy neighbor when you held a debt over their head? Money gained via investment still seemed a bit dirty, and Calvinist ideas of hard work tended to distrust tales of people getting rich overnight. As a result, an enormous amount of criticism descended on the bulb trade before the crash even occurred, mostly taking form in cheaply printed pamphlets, occasionally decorated with a crude woodblock print that called the bulb traders fools and depicted them wearing jesters' caps. And to reach the maximum number of people, they were often written in the form of a two-person dialogue so they could be read aloud like plays in taverns. And since the pamphlet authors were part of the Dutch upper class, they also often featured their share of snooty class critique. After all, traders like those who worked at the Amsterdam stock market were supposed to be a certain class of wealthy. But with tulips, artisans and the middle class, those with no other avenue for investment, were also getting in on the action. And worse, they were at least, on paper, succeeding. So what did that mean? These weavers and tavern keepers could suddenly make money from buying and selling? Why, that would suggest a social mobility that the upper class simply wasn't comfortable with. So it's unsurprising that in those little plays, the protagonists end up going back to their trades in hopes of eventually earning enough to pay off their debts. However, another type of pamphlet criticized the Tulip Mania itself as irreligious and a form of idol worship. And to get this across visually, they found the perfect symbol, the Roman goddess Flora, a deified former courtesan who happened to be both the patron goddess of flowers and sex workers. These pamphlets argued that Flora was bewitching and enticing, but also greedy and fickle, leaving her worshippers with nothing. It was such a perfect metaphor for the crash that a series of paintings and prints about the mania featured Flora as a central figure. One entitled Ship of Fools shows her aboard a cart with a sail on it that foolish tradesmen are following as it wheels into the sea where they all drowned. These types of paintings also tended to use monkeys as a metaphor for foolishness, with hordes of the animals pooping on tulip traders and whizzing all over their bulbs. Yeah, just an FYI, a lot of classical painting is not as highbrow as you might think. Inevitably, a few tulip traders tried to fight back. One connoisseur published a rebuttal asking people to please not confuse the high-end traders with the common rabble at the colleges, but it didn't really work. The story, distortions and all, had already passed into legend. But what's really interesting about these critical pamphlets is that they're nearly the only documents on the Tulip Mania that survive. It's from them we get attitudes, pricing information, and even how the colleges worked. This is where we get the stories of sad, bankrupt traders, and tulip contracts traded 10 times a day, and early historians drew on them as if they were completely accurate. Which brings us right back to the guy we met in episode 1, Charles Mackay, and his 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Now, it's a good read, well written, often funny, and gives you all the witchcraft trials, crusades, economic bubbles, and relic worship you could possibly want. Plus, its chapter on the Tulip Mania introduced the event into popular culture. The problem is, it's completely inaccurate. Mackay was a journalist, not a historian. He wasn't interested in fact-checking, he just wanted a bestseller, and he was willing to flat out make stuff up to keep things interesting. Not to mention, he was also a plagiarist. He stole the chapter on the Tulip Mania from another author whose book was based almost entirely on those pamphlets critical of the mania. In other words, the image most of us have of the Tulip Mania today comes from a sensationalized book chapter ripped off from another book, which in turn was based on one-sided and probably inaccurate broadsheets. This all blew up the Tulip Mania to be much larger and more significant than it was, to the point that the current idea of the Tulip Mania itself is full circle an extraordinary popular delusion. Oh, and by the way, for all of Mackay's sneering about illogical behavior, he egged on people during the British railway bubble, which unlike the Tulip Mania, did cause an actual financial crisis, so, glass houses. The truth is, after the Tulip Mania, connoisseurs continued to trade tulips at high prices. A few growers did go out of business, but the market stabilized, partially because, as news of the Tulip Mania spread, it created a mental link between tulips and the Netherlands. Dutch tulip growers were soon exporting to neighboring countries, and even the Ottoman Empire. And though the growing methods and preferred types of tulips changed significantly over time, it's still going strong. About 60% of commercial flowers today are grown in the Netherlands, and the tulip fields remain a major tourist attraction. And our mania for tulips and other flowers really didn't end. A fad for hyacinths stormed through the Netherlands a generation later, and France had a wave of bulb buying. Turns out, flowers are just in general desirable and expensive things, and new varieties or imports get people excited. In fact, another tulip craze swept the Ottoman Empire during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, driven by his personal interest in and love for the flower. Between 1718 and 1730, an era in history now called the Tulip Period, it appeared everywhere, and demand for the flower shot up, with common people buying them and the elite collecting rare specimens. However, the Ottoman government did learn from the previous Tulip Mania and stepped in to set prices before things got out of hand. Then the last major craze for flowers occurred in China in 1985, when prices for a specific red lily went through the roof. And actually, full disclosure, we've caught a bit of the Tulip Mania ourselves. While researching it, Rob found himself standing in front of a flower shop display, wondering if he should bring his daughter home some tulips. And Allie, whose wonderful illustrations you've been seeing in this series, decided to try to grow some for herself. Because here's the thing about tulips. They're just flowers. Pretty flowers, sure, but it's the stories we tell about them that give them their worth. Neither Rob nor Allie thought much about them before working on this series, but once a story made them notice the tulip, they wanted some. And the same can be said for Beanie Babies, limited edition sets, Rolexes, celebrity autographs, NFTs, or even in vogue health foods like quinoa and kale. Something's only worth what you're willing to pay for it. So, if there's a takeaway from the Tulip Mania, I think it might be this. Oftentimes, value is subjective, emotionally driven, and varies from person to person. After all, we're all maniacs for something. And if you are a maniac for history like I am, then you've got to check out our updated Extra History store via our brand spanking new rail right below this video. I mean, look at all this cool stuff. You can snag Extra History mugs like our Worst Dad in History mug right here with Vlad the Impaler. We got pins with Walpole and the logo. Ooh, we got coasters. Mine are a little dirty and I'm sorry they might be upside down, but they're really fun. We even have our Zoe plushie or, wait for it, puzzle, depending on how assembled/soft you want your animated cat. But the crown jewel, I think, is our 2026 History Happens Every Day calendar, complete with new historical fact on every day of the year, meaning you could check out what happened today, the day you're watching this video in history, and learn all about it. Plus, there's just a ton of jaw-dropping art from artist David Hueso, who does a lot of our extra histories, and scannable QR codes right here, where you can go essentially to different days that are marked on the calendar, scan here, and get a video that teaches you more about what happened on that day in history. Plus, whenever you buy anything from our store by clicking what catches your eye down below or scanning the QR code right here, you will be directly helping to fund our ability to make more extra history videos, meaning more full-length episodes, more extra history completes, more mini-series like Weird Dudes in History, Recently Deleted History, and our new Recently Repeated Histories, which, sadly, seems to be more important today than ever before. So, to bring more extra history into your home, click or scan here or check out the rail below. And then once you've got all your deals locked in, check out another of our videos that you helped fund right here. Well, I don't know, but I've been told you never grow tired, and Angela Valenciana, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Lotus Wolf, and Zeliad's Architectures are the best legendary patrons, and we're never gonna grow old!